Hello.
All right, fantastic. Welcome to another episode of the Sunday Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here today with Anthony Marquetta, but slightly more importantly, I'm surrounded by Catholics. You guys got us in hell.
Yeah.
More importantly, our guest, Father Wetta, who is with us
Hey.
today to promote his new book, which I have the misfortune of not read yet, but Anthony has. It is this
You,
wonderful uh, book called Pray, Think, Act, Make Better Decisions with the Desert Fathers. How are you gentlemen
I'm
doing today?
great. And for the record, you get 3 free indulgences for every copy you buy. And you get an extra 1,000 years out of purgatory if you write a review on Amazon.
I'm trying to
Ju-
think of a witty rhyme to make out of like every time a copy sells, soul from purgatory springs, but I can't think of a
yeah.
rhyme.
A, a
Uh,
soul, a soul from. Hold on, I can do this. A soul is distanced from the hells.
there you
There
go.
you go. And then,
Martin
what is
Luther did nothing wrong.
it? Well, he did have a point.
I
Mm.
like the
I'll
Martin
give
Luther
him that.
insult generator. I'll give him that. But yeah, so we are here to discuss Pray, Think, Act. The full title is Pray, Think, Act, and I'm trying to pull up the exact link. Yeah, Make Better Decisions with the Desert Fathers.
That's
So
right.
to give you an idea of the sorts of books that I read on the regular, like these are the first like 6 books on my bookshelf: Pray, Think, Act, Our Life of Service, The Handbook for Catholic Deacons, Brideshead Revisited,
Oh yeah.
Trent Horn, Counterfeit Christs, Saint Joan of Arc, A Life Inspired, Will I See My Dog in Heaven, and Saint Vincent Ferrer, The Angel of the Judgment by Father Andrew Pradell. So, you know, uh,
Wow.
just the normal stuff that normal people read who definitely don't have a problem. Uh,
Hey, if you're really into like great literature by Christian authors, there's a very underrated poet slash fantasy author named Marley Yeomans who has written some
Ooh.
incredible stuff, including I know this is supposed to be all about me, but I'm going to give a pitch for one of her books here, which is called the Thaliad, and it's pitched the conceit is that this little group of preschoolers goes into this cave on a field trip, and when they come out, the world has been nuclear wasted, right? Well, none of them know how to read, so they appoint one of them, whose name is Thalia, to be their bard and to sing their history. And so it's a sort of an odyssey sung by a post-apocalyptic child. Hey,
I
it's
am
it's
immediately
brilliant.
sold on this idea, so
She
I will
wrote
be picking that up.
she wrote another book, which I also got to make a pitch for, but I can't remember the name, about the some kids in the Appalachia Mountains who are let's see, I guess there were little towns that got flooded on purpose. They transplanted all the people but left the town there and built dams back at during the New Deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and anyway, they're these kids are in a canoe on the lake and they're looking down at the town that's underwater, and they realize there are all these people that live down there and have little lives, like walking around underwater and doing their thing. Anyway, it's she's brilliant, but she's sort of a writer. I think she never quite made or makes mainstream, but writers love her.
Ah, interesting. Reminds me a little bit of,
What's the name of that one
although
again?
to a much lesser extent.
I can't remember. I think it's called. Oh,
Thaliad?
Mar. There's the Thalia, which is my personal favorite because I'm big into the Iliad and Odyssey, into Homer and classics. She's also sort of a big fan of the classical forms.
Hmm.
Um, but she wrote a fantasy. I wish I could remember what the fantasy. there's Wildwood, but that's not it. I'll figure it out in a second.
Sure.
Interesting though. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit though. Certainly not to the same extent because he definitely did have at least a measure of mainstream success, but of Gene Wolfe.
Ooh, who's
Like,
that?
so Gene Wolfe is similar type of thing where it's like he's not super well known among the general populace, though looking at just the sheer number of Amazon reviews comparatively, he definitely did better than Yeomans did, but uh
Yeah.
he was a Catholic sci-fi author who's like not super mainstream. None of his stuff, as far as I know, has ever been adapted to like movies or. But for people who know him, he's considered like arguably the greatest sci-fi author ever. Uh,
Really?
he was a Catholic too, but he was very like almost I want to say quiet about it, where it's philosophically there in his books, and you can learn that about him through interviews, but it's definitely not something that's as obvious as like a Canticle for Leibowitz, which is
Oh
very
yeah.
in your face Catholic.
Mm.
But he has a series, his most famous. I've been trying hard to get into Gene Wolfe, right? Because so many of my favorite authors love Gene Wolfe. Uh, and I cause like he is notoriously convoluted. Gene Wolfe is very famous for not telling you anything directly and just like and having unreliable narrators. Like, so he is a very difficult read. Even his easier
Mm.
works have those elements to them. So I've been trying hard to get into Wolfe, and I've been struggling with him. But his masterpiece is generally considered to be the Book of the New Sun, which is like this post-apocalyptic story following
Mm.
a torture. It's set in the very far future, like so far that you can't tell like what time period it is. Basically, it's almost medieval-esque if it
Yeah.
weren't for like the high technology type stuff. And Severian, the main character, is a torturer in the Guild of Torturers,
Oh yes.
and he is
It's something.
expelled for showing mercy to a girl by killing her quickly.
This is
And
a
then it just
Shadow and
follows him.
Claw or something.
That's
Is
it.
it?
Yep,
That's it.
that's the guy.
Yes. Boy, you know who you? Okay, another author you ought to read is Dearda, Michael Dearda. He's a book critic, but he's the one who put me on to Shadow and Claw. He's one of the few book critics who has won the Pulitzer, and he's just brilliant. But he's a member of the Ghost Story Society and things like that. He wrote one really brilliant little short story about a man who lives in a library and the books begin to talk to him and things. And anyway, it's a do you know the oblique approach by let's see
Oblique
Yes,
approach.
by Eric.
Belisarius.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's by Eric Harris, I think. But that's a really good series.
Eric
Eric
Flint.
Flint.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm just thinking, man, you guys are like my people. I've never known people who read these books like with the same consistency. That's great.
I
You
loved it.
know Eric
Uh,
Flint, huh?
Oh yeah,
I
like
love it.
I'm one of those guys who kind of just picks and chooses most authors, but the oblique approach, like the Belisaria series, is absolutely fantastic. A 10 out of 10
The
read.
the have you read oh gosh, oh no, I can't remember it. Oh, forget it.
Do
I'll
you mind
remember
if
it in
I
a second.
interrupt so that we can get to your book?
Yeah.
Uh, before we turn people off by going like, "Oh man, have you read this? Have you read this?" and getting excited. Uh,
Oh no.
I will also admit freely to I haven't even finished the Brideshead Revisited. I've only started it. Uh,
You've
it's in,
never finished Brideshead
but
Revisited?
but it's in the top of my Kindle. I was reading it yesterday, so I'm trying to get back into it. So,
You have to
hopefully, I will
visit
be finishing it
Oxford
soon.
after you read it because you really can't understand it until you've walked around the streets at Oxford. It's it's
I have
it's
It's
so
another one of those
Oxford.
books that so many of my favorite writers have like referred to as like, oh, it's one of the ultra masterpieces, right? Like that I kind of have to try it one day. But
Yeah.
the truth is, I'm really I'm something of a fraud in terms of my tastes in reading. You think it's like, oh, you must read all of these high quality books, and I put them down very quickly because I'm like, this is way too hard for me. Uh, so a lot of my stuff is not quite as hard as you might think, or as classic as you might think.
As
Iliad and
esoteric.
yeah, like the Iliad, for example. I've seen a one-man show version of the Iliad that was
Oh
incredible, called An
no.
Iliad. I loved it. It was an actor. It was just an actor that was basically doing the Iliad. Was awesome, awesome. Have I finished reading it? I'm like, I want to say halfway through reading the Iliad, and I'm reading the. I've tried multiple translations, and I'm reading the Alexander Pope translation, which I know is not
Yeah.
considered. I know is not considered accurate, but which I enjoy personally
Well,
more than the others. But
whenever I teach it, I have my students read different versions, and they always prefer the Pope version, but they like reading. They think the Pope version's the greatest, but they like reading Fagel's.
yeah, Fagel seems to be the popular pick. But let's go back to Pray Think
Yeah.
Act. No, Pray Think Act, make better decisions with the Desert Fathers. Now, I did read this book. Luckily, it was just at the right level for my puny brain to comprehend and finish in a couple of sittings. So,
Hey, hey, right? Can I include that on the cover, on the back cover? Just big
oh
enough for
yeah,
my
that's
puny brain.
a great pull
Recommended
quote.
by. Actually, I might throw that in there. We'll talk after the show. So that'd be fun. That'd be a great little like quote to put on the front. Great enough for my puny brain. That's a good soundbite.
Uh, there you go. That I do actually mean that as a compliment though, because
Yeah.
it's very readable. Yeah, it's very breezy. It's a lot of fun, honestly. As weird as that sounds, like you wouldn't think that a book with this topic you wouldn't associate with fun, but I found it to be pretty funny, pretty humorous. I knew already that I enjoyed your sense of humor from the Eighth Arrow, which I thought was very funny. So
Oh, thanks.
this book, some of that humor is similar. So first, let's get back to the beginnings here. Why did you decide to write it? How'd you come up with the idea?
Well, okay, so I wrote this book on humility for kids, and that went over pretty well. In fact, we're over 100,000 copies now and over 1,000 reviews on Amazon. So even Amazon's starting
Wow.
to give me some respect. I
Mhm.
had to get, in fact, it's doing so well, I had to give myself an award for my humility. It wasn't big enough, but it'll hold me over. Um, but and it so it went over really well. But then the next, well, I guess both of these books were in response to assignments by my abbot. First, the abbot put me in charge of our high school chaplaincy, and I got sort of tired of hearing about all this stuff about self-esteem, and decided to write a sort of anti-self-esteem book, which was Humility Rules. But then now that Abbott has made me the director of vocations for the monastery, and I'm finding that these kids tend to have humility kind of nailed. What they can't do is make up their mind. And it's at a level like even below discernment, which there are lots of books out there on discernment, particularly like the discernment of
Mhm.
spirits and things. But this is just like making up your mind about what to eat for dinner is really hard for these kids. And so I've well, and for me too now, and I find that really that's sort of the next big hurdle for most of us is just making a decision and then committing to it. Um, so I started giving sermons in the school and preaching to the kids. The kids started asking me questions. I started reading psychology books. I have this thing about psychology books. I probably missed my vocation to be a psychotherapist, but um, and pretty soon this book came out on the other side.
So, yeah, I'll tell you as well that, like, in terms of my reading it, one of the reasons I read it is because, Leon, we'll be straightforward here. We have the show. We had you on once for a book that I very much did enjoy. And I was like, oh, he has a new book. Uh, we should, I should read it so that we could give him a platform, right? That's kind of what we do here. Uh,
Awesome.
but I also, it's definitely a topic that is always on my mind, like how to make decisions, what's the right decision to make. And Ben and I honestly talk about this quite a bit on our own, along with our other co-writer of the Pinkerton's Ghost team that we have here, Ken. Like what we're going to do and what we're going to do next and what decisions we're going to make, not just with our channel, but with our lives overall. It's on our minds, right? Like, so this is a topic that I was cognizant as I was reading it of, oh, I could use this,
Well, so was
So,
I actually. The thing is, it's partly a book for. I guess all writers basically write for themselves first, but it's. I find that I get so bogged down in making decisions that often I never actually make them, and that's what this book was trying to sort of simplify the process. And of course, the Desert Fathers are such great models for that because their theology is so basic. you know, they read it in scripture, they take it pretty literally, and they put it into action. And these are not the sort of guys who put their hand to the plow and look back. They really, when they decide to do something, they do it. So I think they're good models for
yeah,
great decision making.
I'd agree. The Desert Fathers remind me in some ways, and I don't think that this is a coincidence, of St. Francis,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
and the reason this isn't a coincidence is because St. Francis was in many ways just getting back to a simpler version of Christianity, which
right.
is what the Desert Fathers were. They were that. Like, they were the first, I guess, what you would call like intense Christian, maybe the second, if you want to put the apostles at first.
Hmm.
The second generation of intense Christians, right?
Right.
Like they were the ones that, all right, Christianity has been established as a thing, right? Not necessarily as the dominant cultural force, not necessarily as like persecution's over, but it exists. It's in the world, right?
Right.
Like it is now a live option. So what does that
Well,
mean?
and
Yeah.
that's the key, is it's a live option, because before, if you were really hardcore Christian, you ended up getting eaten by lions or something. But
Yeah.
now that Christian is mainstreamed, you're kind of out of luck if you want to be martyred. So they invent this, what they
Yeah.
call
And
the
you say
white
that
martyrdom. Yeah.
you're absolutely right. You say that, and it sounds like sort of facetious, but it's really not. Like Saint Francis, for example, again, he was like
Yeah.
his dream was to be martyred. Like he wanted, he wanted to be martyred,
Yeah,
and it
walk
was like,
straight to Arabia to get it done, right? But they liked him
yeah,
so much, they
and it was
cheated him
actually
out of his
considered
martyrdom.
like kind of a curse, or like not a curse. That's the wrong way to put it. I'm trying to think of the right
No.
word. Like a
Just
trial is a better way of putting it. A trial that he had to live out his entire life to old age. Like he considered that a trial.
well,
You know,
what is it? Julius Caesar said it's easy to find a man who will give his life for a cause. It's very difficult to find a man who will live his life for a cause. And I've
yeah,
always, when I went through my atheist stage, I got really into Nietzsche, as I guess most people do when they become atheists. Either that or they soften it up with Ayn Rand. But uh, Nietzsche says, I think in the in his no, it's in a book which is called, I kid you not, Why I Am So Wise.
ah,
Not
that's
short on
funny.
humility, this guy. But he writes that you can tell the value of a man's convictions by how much he will bet on them. And that's kind of what led, that one quote is kind of what led me back to Christianity, because I got to thinking, like, yeah, okay, so you can find martyrs for lots of causes, lots of people willing to die, but like, is there anyone around who, like, I think that's the roots of my vocation, really, that I thought, I got to thinking, like, is there a way to give everything, like, and then keep
Yeah,
giving everything?
I totally I totally understand what you're saying as well. Like so it's funny because it's like the saints that I admire the most in many ways are the saints that are the most unlike myself. Uh,
Mm.
which is, I guess, true of many people with many things, right? Like I admire Saint Francis tremendously, and one of the reasons I admire him is that he would throw himself into the faith and was utterly fearless. He did not
Yeah.
fear the reactions of his family. He did not fear the reactions of the townspeople. He did not fear anything.
Didn't
You
fear
know,
the reaction of the Sultan when he
yeah,
walks down to
he'll
Saudi
strip naked in front of the judge and walk out of the courthouse because, you know,
We
uh,
need more of these guys. You know,
he
Mother
would.
Teresa, I think, was like that.
Mother Teresa definitely had that air about her, yes, but that's one of the reasons I love St. Francis so much, and that's entirely unlike myself, right? Like, you know,
Yeah.
every now and then I have this image in my head of like, man, it would be I admit that there is like temptation might be the wrong word because I don't think it's really a bad thing, but I'm going to call it temptation colloquially. A temptation in the back of my mind of like, man, it would be nice to like give up all my stuff and just join the friars, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
friars of the renewal or something. Uh,
Oh, don't do
but
that. Those guys have only been around for like 400 years. You want to go with the originals. Join the Benedictines. Come down to St. Louis. There's no telling how long these Franciscans are going to be around for, right? Or Dominicans or Jesuits. They've only, we predate them by about 1,000 years. So
well, yeah,
you
and
want to bet on a
in my
sure
life,
thing, right?
yeah, right. In my life, I've ended up making my own, decisions and convictions and things like that. But there's always like in the back of my mind, it's like, wouldn't it be nice to just like not have, and this is why it's also a temptation that it's wrong. And I've had this discussion that
Right.
like why it's wrong, but wouldn't it be nice to have nothing to worry about except your abbot tells you to do something or the head of the friary tells you to do something and you do it and you don't have things that you need to worry about, and your
Mhm.
responsibilities are what they tell you to do and nothing else. Isn't that nice? And then I go, I'm I'm gonna do that though, and I'm gonna regret it instantly because that's not at all what it's like.
Well,
Like,
it
and I
is and
know
it
that.
isn't. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
ideal. One of my favorite sayings of the Desert Fathers is from a conference by Dorotheus of Gaza. He says that he's talking to his monks. He says, "We all gave up everything to come out here into the desert to seek a life of contemplation and poverty." He says, "And yesterday I saw two of you fighting over a shovel." And yeah,
That's
and
funny.
it's yeah, and we do that constantly, I do it constantly. I won't blame my brethren for this one, but so you're right. But so on the one hand, you're right. Yeah, you bring your problems in with you, and you make your life complicated. But on the other hand, that is why I'm here, is so that I can just focus on Jesus. I mean,
Hmm.
although of course I find 1.5 billion excuses to do other things.
Now, for myself, talking about like my own decisions I've made and then thinking through the pray, think, act structure,
Oh
right?
yes.
Like, and for myself, I ultimately ended up making a concrete decision that I'm not going to get into on air, but where I was like, I think I'm going to
Oh,
end up
go
staying
ahead.
with partially, right? That I'm going to end up staying with that I'm going to end up staying a lay person, at least for now. I do think that one day I may end up a deacon, but
Cool.
that would be in the future and and probably not a priest. I do think that a deacon might be in my future, but like not
It's the celibacy thing, isn't it? That's what's keeping you out.
uh the in all seriousness, partially.
Well, yeah.
Like that's
If it
not
weren't, you
entirely,
would be.
but partially.
Yeah.
Various things though, right? So,
Yeah.
and I kind of made that decision, and it involved in retrospect though, because I didn't have your book at the time, but that structure.
Sure.
And part of it was the structure was out of order. I was overthinking things, as Ben can tell you, because uh, Ben ended up functioning, and I function, I think, partially at least for him, as something of an accountability partner in this, where I would be talking with Ben and complaining, and Ben is a good enough friend of mine that he would call me out for it. You know, it would be like, eventually there was a job that I was worried about taking because I would have had to move, and I didn't know if it was the right thing to do, and what am I going to say. And Ben like called me out and said, "What on earth are you worried about? You've been offered a job. Why are you just not telling your family about this? What's the problem?" And he said that, and I thought about it, and like a couple hours later I messaged him and said, "You are completely correct. I don't know what I was worried about. Don't yeah." Like don't message me again. This was like a real conversation. He's like, this better be the end of it. I'm just like, no, it actually is. And the next day I was like, yeah, there's this job that I was offered in like a few 100 miles away or something like that. I said, but I don't think I'm going to take it, and I just told my family that. And it's like, and that was that. I ended up not taking it. But the point is, the problem was I had gotten the order wrong, right? I had done my thinking before my praying, and I was delaying action.
Yeah. Sounds like Ben's your confessor.
Ugh.
Or your spiritual director, at least.
Ben does not know all of the terrible things I do.
He doesn't. And Anthony doesn't know all the terrible things that I do.
I'll bet he
You think I have lily white hands after living in St. Louis? Nonsense. Father Wetta, you and I both know that we do horrible things just trying to get to a McDonald's.
Yeah, not
all
me.
those orphans.
I'm a good and holy priest of God. I don't sin.
That just means you pray over the. No, I'm kidding.
There, I just committed a sin just then. Oh well, it all came tumbling down. This elaborate edifice of virtue that I built for myself.
The good news is that as Catholics, we could sin as much as we want as long as
That's
we buy
right.
enough indulgence. So
yeah, as long as you buy enough copies of my book, you won't have to worry about it.
So yeah, we're pretty much guaranteed entrance into heaven. I have like 5,000 sins in the bank right now. I have a little counter. Every time I commit a sin, I go, 4,999 to go. I'm fine.
When I was little and my mom would tuck me into bed, she'd say, whenever you pray, you build yourself a mansion in heaven. And I took that like literally. I was like, okay, I'm making a couch now. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Okay, and now is the television. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Okay, and then, but it needs a remote control. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Like, I'd like build my whole house out of prayers. Actually, that's kind of cute, isn't it? There's a sermon in there somewhere.
There's
I was a little
something to it in like the Jesus describing the Father's house as a mansion with many rooms or something like that.
Yep.
So there's something.
The Protestants believe that heaven is a place of work and labor, that we will be building the next universe.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not even joking. Our afterlife involves work.
Well, yeah, it would have to, because work. I mean, all the most pleasurable things involve work.
Oh,
so
yes.
why wouldn't it? Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Well, tell me more about this. I'd never heard that heaven is going to be spent building something.
Well, so after the apocalypse, there's a new heaven and new earth.
Oh, right.
And so the general assumption is that it is a whole new universe, as it should have been, perfect, unmarred by sin. And so we are called to be stewards of this earth. Therefore, and also there's other verses that talk about, the things we do as worshipful for God, and everything that we do for the Lord and so on. Therefore, we shall be stewards of this new universe, and
that
bring
makes
it,
sense,
etc.
I don't think that's in conflict with any Catholic doctrine. At any rate, I like that idea. I'm going to start spreading it around Catholic circles. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't get burned at the stake for that.
It reminds me of reminds me of Lewis in The Last Battle.
Yeah,
a little bit. Not that they're building anything at the end of it, but the whole new heaven. And I remember I was watching a video by Father Gregory Pine, who's a Dominican.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine.
and-
The last time I saw him, I gave him a wet willy. He was in the middle of a radio interview and he couldn't do anything. He couldn't
That's
do
very
anything. He was it was at this youth conference and he was talking. I both ears at the same time, and this look of utter horror like came over him. But he had to keep talking without changing his pace. So I sent him an apology later, saying, "Look, sorry about that." He said I would expect nothing less. So I was on. He has a podcast called Godsplaining,
Yeah,
where we talked about humor and how far is too far, and what's
Uh,
there's good humor and bad humor.
but yeah, Father Pine, who is great, love Father Pine.
Yeah,
He was
is.
talking about what the new heaven, the new earth would be like, and he makes the point of going like, so first we need to establish that we know very little, because St. Paul says, like, the eye is not seen and the ear has not heard what God has prepared for those who love him, or something along those lines.
And the
right?
bodies could be so different. It's gonna be like the difference between a tree and a seed.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
all here,
so-
but we're gonna be so much greater.
He's like, the first thing we need to establish is that we really understand nothing, like, not substantially. He says, but with that said, there are things that are stated that we could draw some conclusions. And one of the conclusions he draws, he says, so there's a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. And he makes the point of saying, therefore, it seems as if, like, the political and structures that we had on earth, and like the world as we knew it, is not going to just be entirely replaced with something incomprehensible. Like that there will still be polities, like
Oh, cool.
cities, governments, things like that. He goes, we don't know what form they'll take, right? Or how exactly that would work. But like the general way that humans form bonds and organize things
Yeah.
is not going to disappear in the next life,
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's
which was
cool.
an interesting point to make, I thought. And I think he made this point in a discussion of, do animals go to heaven? And, as all good Christians do, in the modern day anyway, he is agnostic on the subject because, number one, that's responsible. Number two, very few people are so cold-hearted or so ruthlessly logical as to say, no, you'll never see Fido again.
I am. I tell all my students that their dogs are going to hell. It's become an
All
inside
piffles.
joke. Yeah, I'm like, I have this kid named Thomas Rempe who his dog just died, and he's like, I'm going to see my dog in heaven, right? I said, nope. And he's like, well, I just disagree with the church on this one. I disagree. So every time I see him, I say, your dog's in hell, Rempe. Your dog. Luckily, they take what I say with a pretty substantial grain of salt.
Maybe it's like in the Eighth Arrow. Maybe that hell is dog heaven.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's right, because he meets his dog in hell, doesn't he? So
They have, that's
well, they
I
have
can't
souls,
remember the book
right? They
better
just
than
don't
you.
have spirits, or they have spirits. They just
So
don't
they don't have
souls.
immortal souls. We
Yeah, they have
know for a
spirits. They
fact,
have
we can
animating
prove
souls.
logically, because humans can create abstractions, that the human soul is immortal. There is a part of the human soul that is not dependent on and will survive the death of the body.
Wait,
right?
why would being able to create abstractions prove that?
So I'm going off of a Thomistic argument here, so you're going to have to forgive me since I am not St. Thomas. But my understanding...
I do not forgive
sadly.
you. I can't. You'll
Sadly.
have to buy one of my books.
Darn. I'll have to add another one to the indulgence pile. Anyway, yeah, the argument goes something along the lines of, so an abstraction is the ability to conceive of something that exists but not materially. And
Oh.
one of the ways to think about this is to say, all right, so think of a chair. Now, you might be thinking of a chair that looks like a real chair that actually exists, but even if this is still hard for you, now imagine that real chair that actually exists, all of them are destroyed. can you still think of the chair in your head? The answer is yes, right?
Yeah.
Humans have that ability to think of a chair. Yeah.
Oh.
So that's an abstraction. And because we have the ability to conceive of abstract things that do exist but not materially, things that only exist uh, intellectually, I think is the term that would be used. Therefore, we have an intellect can that exists beyond the body. I think that the argument, Tom, there's a longer train of argument that I don't recall off the top of my head that goes along lines of like the fact that we can conceive of that
Oh
means that
yeah. It
our
must
minds,
exist.
must be in that plane as well, partially. Like I forget exactly how he puts it. There's a
That's
term for it.
Anselm's argument, right? He says God is that thing greater than which you can't conceive, but we can all conceive of it, but we couldn't conceive of it because it's beyond our intellect. Therefore, God must exist.
Something along those lines. I
Yeah.
loved. I used to teach logic, and I loved teaching the ontological argument because I said what's great about the ontological argument is because as soon as you hear it, you think that can't possibly be correct, but it's almost impossible to figure out how it's wrong
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's probably not. Honestly, I know that Thomas wasn't super impressed by it.
Well, no one's impressed by it. It's like the definition of a circular argument.
Right, but then when you
But it's not.
actually get
Yeah.
down to it, it's very difficult to actually
That's
figure
right.
out what the problem is. So I said I love the ontological argument because it makes you feel like an idiot. And
Mhm.
as to Thomas's argument, St. Thomas's arguments for the existence of God too, but for a different reason. Because St. Thomas will start off with something like very simple that basically no sane human being can deny. And then 5 steps later, you're at, and therefore God exists. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
And then you go through the argument, and again, it's like, it seems like that can't possibly be true, but
Mhm.
where's the problem? There is none. So it's like everything that exists must have a cause. Yeah, I mean, sure, it exists, right? Like, they don't just pop in from nothing, right? And then you go, okay, therefore, and then 4 steps later, therefore God exists. And you go, wait, what? How do we get there? And then you go through step by step, and you're like, wow, I would never have figured that out from that from that very basic fact of life.
And the best part
And
is he wrote it while he was simultaneously while he was writing 3 other books, right? He had 4 scribes who he would dictate 4 different books to all at the same time.
G.K. Chesterton has a great story in his biography of Aquinas. In he in his biographies, he has biographies of Francis and Aquinas. He will sometimes pepper in stories about other saints who are around at the time, and they'll be very quick sketches because it's not a biography of them, but he'll give you a sketch of who they are. He did this with Saint Clare in the Francis biography, and he does it with Saint Louis in the Aquinas biography because Saint Louis was contemporaneous with Aquinas. And he
Really?
tells the story. Yeah,
Yep.
Aquinas was a visitor in the court of St. Louis. And in the court of St. Louis, they said that. So St. Louis, they go, what made him such a great king is that he was only a king, like, he was only a great king, like, by happenstance. I forget exactly how Chesterton puts it, but it's like, he would have been a great general if he had been a general. He would have been a great farmer if he had been a farmer. And because he just so happened to be the king, he was a great king, right? Like, he viewed it
Huh.
as, this is the role that I have. I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And just by virtue of having this role does not make me greater or lesser. It's just the duties that I need to perform, right? Which is a great insight into the mind of Lewis, I thought.
Yeah.
And they said Lewis and Thomas could not have been more different people, right? Like, Thomas was hyper introverted to the point where people actually thought he might be slow because he almost never talked. That's where you get like the dumb ox. Dumb really means mute, not stupid. That's
Right.
like he barely ever spoke. So he's a visitor. At this point, he's already famous for having published several things and being a great teacher in the court of St. Louis. And they said, now, St. Louis might be a good king, but there's still decorum that you need to have in the court of a king. And St. Louis did have decorum in his court, and there was still a way you were expected to act. But St. Thomas was distracted because he was thinking of solving some problem, a dispute with the Manicheans, which was a heresy that was going on. And he says that in the middle of this dinner, at this great court, all of a sudden, St. Thomas slams his hand down and interrupts all of the conversation going on and yells out to the startled people, "That's how I'll settle the Manicheans." And they said everybody pauses and turns to Lewis to figure out how to react. And Lewis, they said, in one of the great moments that shows the character of both men, he leans over to like his aide who's next to him and whispers, "You better get a parchment and pen. This is probably important." Uh,
Good for him.
so it's a great story.
That
So
is a great story.
St. Thomas is another one, a very different person from Francis, but much like Francis, Thomas was a man who was not afraid of the reactions of other people. He was famously kidnapped by the Holy Roman Emperor and imprisoned in a tower because his family wanted him to be a Benedictine abbot.
Well, yeah, and think of what a great stuff he would have done if you were a Benedictine. We'd probably have figured out all the heresies. Oh well.
He probably have just solved Christianity.
Yeah, we'd all be perfect Christians by now if he'd just if he just listened to his parents.
So
You people.
we've gotten off track, but it's a
You
fun off
people.
track, so I'm okay with that. I'm okay with getting off track if the conversation's interesting, and I think it was. So, but let's try and get back on a little bit, somewhat.
Right.
So, Pray Think Act. Now, early in the book, you compare your decision-making process in the book to two other decision-making processes. I think of doctors and of psychologists.
Oh yeah, I do. You're right.
There you go. I was looking at it yesterday to prime myself for this, so my memory isn't that great. But
I wrote it. And I forgot about that part. But you're right. Yeah, psychologists think there are 5 stages. I think doctors think there are 7 or something, or 6. And then sociologists have another set of decision making. And then somebody actually wrote a really great review on Amazon that describes the military decision making process. There's a special sort of code name for it, but I'm all for the simplest way possible, which is Paphnutius's way.
yeah, the 3-step, which you could subdivide, I suppose, into a 9-step process if you feel like
Right.
3 is a little too simple for you. So let's try and go through this step by step so you could go through your thesis a little bit with us, right?
All right.
Retreat, repent, rebuild is how we go through pray. So what do you mean by retreat? Like what does retreat mean in this context of making a decision?
Well, it means letting the mud settle, as it were, right? The story for the Desert Fathers, which I won't tell in its entirety, is just that this guy starts with a bowl full of mud, but the longer he looks at it, the more clearly he can see his reflection. And the idea being that I think we have a tendency to run around and think we've got to make 20 different decisions all at once, or make it while we're in the middle of something else. But if you can stop and find some silence and let all the debris sort of settle for a bit, then I think you're in a much better position to address any issue, frankly, not just making decisions. I give a lot of talks to teenage kids, and the one piece of advice I keep giving them over and over and over again is just find 2 minutes, turn your phone off, put it in another room, lock yourself in a bathroom or a closet or something, and just have 2 minutes of silence. There's absolute no video games, no music, no podcasts, not even brilliant podcasts like this one. Just just allow your mind to empty, because you can't you can't hear God when you've got a thousand other voices shouting in your ear, because God tends to speak very quietly. In fact, God, I think, speaks the language of silence, and that's another quote from a desert father. But so retreat, sorry, just means to stop what you're doing and relax for a bit. Count to 10, as your mother would have said.
I see. So I'm trying to think of how to put this. So in a practical context, you would say you don't necessarily need to go anywhere special, though that could be a good thing to do, obviously,
Yeah.
but you don't need to. You just need to take a moment to sit in silence and let this work on your mind.
Right. Well, and you never know. God might just actually tell you the answer. Could be that easy, right? But you have to
Yeah.
slow down and listen first before you can hear anything at all.
So it's interesting you say that. So this is a real experience that I once had where I was helping a friend with something. And because they're not here and I didn't get permission from them to tell the story, I'm going to be very vague intentionally on details. But uh, the what they did, this was a yeah. So what was happening with I'm trying to think of how to put it in a way that they would be okay with, and I think I can do it, but I need to be very careful of how I word things.
I love
Uh,
it. I already like the story, though. I gotta say.
no, it's an interesting from my perspective anyway. I found it at the time to be a very profound moment, right? So this was a woman who I was interested in asking out, and she said she needed a ride somewhere. So, me being interested in asking her out, said, "I'm free. I'll do it." And then she goes, "Where are you going?" And then she goes, "Well, it's to a retreat for a nunnery, basically." Right.
Oh,
So I thought about it, and I said, "Yeah, you know what? I'll do it." And
yeah.
I did it,
Forbidden
and then
fruit
I
and
went
all that.
straight to a shrine, and I sat and I prayed and I said, "What am I doing?" And I literally I got confession, so there's repent in there, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and then I prayed to God and I said God, what am I doing? Like like why am I doing this and what did I do? So the next day, go and pick her up, and the nun who was in charge walks up to me in the car when I go to pick her up and says, "You were the answer to a prayer." And
Whoa.
she says that to me, and then I looked up and I sighed and I said, "Okay, I get it, God." like, y-
What did you get? I don't get it.
the why I was asked to do it was because I was the answer to someone else's prayer.
Oh.
So that was kind of like, okay, I understand a little bit now of what was going on. It was an interesting experience from my perspective because I would always tell people, and I still tell people that, I know people who God has spoken to, verbally, and who I believe, that they're not insane. They're not saying this. It's God told me to, there's a guy who was schizophrenic, and God told him to build an operating system that connected with heaven, uh,
Hmm.
which is that's a real thing, by the way. Temple OS, sad story actually, but
What? Oh, who
Temple
created it?
OS. It was a guy who was schizophrenic, and he believed that God told him to build an operating system that can interface with heaven. And he did. He built it, but he ended up
Oh.
he wasn't sane. Yeah.
Oh.
Yes,
But so it didn't work?
he built an operating system.
Which, by the way, is a super genius level of intellect. They said if you're a programmer, to hear that a single person builds an entire operating system, they said just to hear that sentence we make your head spin. That's such an insanely genius thing to do.
So I gotta ask, has anybody actually tried to use the operating system to get to heaven yet? I mean, does it
I have
work?
not, but people have. There's not much to it. It's
Aw.
it like types back like random phrases from supposedly from God or whatever. But
Maybe
like I know
chat
people.
AI is what's gonna get us
Yeah,
there.
it's either God or Satan. Uh,
Well, I have a friend who thinks that it's definitely demonic. That it's like a Ouija board because it addresses that space in between certainty and chaos that like Ouija boards and tarot cards
I know
address.
people who think that. Having used it myself, I'm very unconvinced by this. The truth
Oh,
is, it just
really?
strikes
That's
me
silly.
as a very rudimentary, or I should say, a very not rudimentary, in-out system like any other computer. Like
Yeah.
it just recycles things that other people have used and
Yeah.
regurgitates them using correct grammar. And if you think about it, grammar is something that is theoretically learnable with a machine, right? So
Yeah.
there's nothing that says that it can't regurgitate information in a grammatically correct way as long as you create a complicated enough program that it can do that. So that's all. That's what it strikes me as. I think
Whew.
that's all it is. Uh,
Okay, good.
I mean, I do like. I answer that seriously, even though it sounds ridiculous, because it is
No,
a
I
thing that
got it.
like I'm willing to consider the idea, but I don't think so. Uh,
Mm. Yeah.
so, but I know people who like God speaks to them, right? Like
Right.
that they have said before, who are not insane, they're not schizophrenic, and they don't, they don't go around like pausing in the middle of the street and looking up and going, "Oh, God told me to go left" or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
but they have said, "Yeah, God has actually spoken to me," and that is, I've never had that sort of religious experience before, right?
Yeah,
Praying in
me
churches,
either.
praying whatever. I've never heard the voice of God actually say and answer a question directly. I've always been like, well, now what? So, this experience is the closest I have ever come to asking God a question and then having it get answered very directly. Uh, so, I appreciated that, right? Uh, you're right, is what I'm saying, that sometimes God will tell you. Like, we assume that he won't, but because he normally doesn't. That's normally not what he
His
does.
modus operandi.
But only normally. He sometimes will.
Yeah. Well, that's my.
So,
Yeah,
oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I have a student who said to me he's an atheist. He just decided he's an atheist. Undid 7 years of work on my part, but anyway, that he's an atheist because when he prays he doesn't get answers. And I said, well, that doesn't mean he's not there. And he said, well, if I had a telephone and somebody gave me a phone number and every time I called there was no answer, I would just assume nobody lived there. And I was like, good enough. But then all you have to do is get one answer, so keep trying. I've never had an answer
Yeah,
either, frankly,
the
but
founder of the app Hello was on the Pints with Aquinas show, and he was discussing that. He said that he had kind of logicked himself into a stalemate with God's existence. I'm summarizing a pretty, his whole story, a long, complicated
yeah.
story, but like basically he had in his mind argued himself into a stalemate over does God exist or not. He'd basically become convinced it was impossible to know either way. He said, unless, of course, he goes, there is one exception to this. If God actually spoke to me, well, that would answer that, right? He says, so I decided to try praying, and I prayed. And he goes, and I set a regimen. It goes 6 months every day. I would pray for a half hour, something like that. It might have been 6 months. It might have even been a year or whatever. And he was like nothing for the majority of it. And then he told a priest he was doing this, and the priest said, I have a question for you. He goes, when you go and talk to your family, do you start off with a regimented list of, hello, thank you for listening. This is what I want you to do. Goodbye. And then he's like, well, no. And he goes, well, then, like, why do you think that that's an okay way to talk to God?
Well, that's
And then
actually
he's
really
like,
cool.
he changed the way that he prayed. And he says, and I got the answer, and like God answered. And then he created the prayer app to help people, pray in a way, pray better, I guess is how I would put it. Uh, so
Huh.
it was an interesting story. Uh,
Yeah.
Going then to step 2 in
Oh
your
yeah.
list, repent. So,
Mm.
why is repent an important part of the decision-making process?
Highly
Like what?
underrated, by the way. Though probably not by our fundamentalist brethren. They've got repentance down. They understand their sinfulness. But Catholics tend to have a trouble with this one. But yeah, I think if you when it comes to making a decision, you want to have as clear a mind as possible. And if that mind is full of sin, well, that's not gonna. You need to sort of try to clear out the dross, right? To uh, i bad habits, bad thoughts, bad actions all cloud your decision making process. So the second step then, once you've taken enough time to be quiet and listen to what God has to say, is to then clean out the vessel so that it's ready to receive the truth. Um, I guess I hadn't actually thought of this until now, but I'm teaching this theology of the body class to, God help me, high school juniors. And oops, I just forgot where I was going with this. We were just talking about, oh, nope, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. Ah,
Repentance and
I
decision,
started
the
thinking about
importance
how
of repentance.
horrible my students are. Um, yeah, that you've really got to have a clear mind when it comes to making these decisions. And any habit that or vice that you have cultivated is going to make that decision all the harder to come to. Um, I think that's what I told him. I can't remember. My mind, what is it? Graham Greene said his mind was more like a mulch pile than a filing cabinet, and so it may come out eventually. But yeah,
Yeah,
the
so the way that I would think of it is that first you're praying to God for something, right?
right.
I mentioned that repent first. The reason you would repent first is that if you're going to ask a favor of someone who you have gravely offended,
Oh,
that's one angle, right, that I would think of it. You're
yeah,
asking a favor of someone, meanwhile, it's like I want to know if I should take this job. Meanwhile, I'm looking at pornography and it's like, why should I be helping you when you clearly don't care, about even the basics of Christian life, right?
right.
Uh,
But also, if you're trying to make a beautiful decision, having your head filled with these ugly images is not gonna. You're actually training yourself to prefer the ugly and the false. So
mhm.
repenting is one way of just I don't know, wiping the slate clean or trying to the ancient Greeks, what their philosophy was. I mean, one of the reasons why they made all these beautiful statues and architecture and stuff is they said that we, as human beings, we introduce so much ugliness into our lives that a beautiful statue replaces just one of those ugly things with a beautiful thing. And if we can keep if we can keep looking at beautiful things, we will eventually drive all the ugly images out. And I think that's sort of part of it too. That you can't. I just again, I'm not so concerned with discernment as I am with just making a good decision. Um, and this is just a basic sort of logical approach that the Desert Fathers took. That they just said, look, if we want to do the right thing, the first thing you got to do is repent. Just because all that ugliness gets in the way, right? All those ugly habits, ugly images, ugly thoughts, ugly propaganda that you've listened to on the radio or seen on
Yeah,
television.
you're absolutely right. It reminds me of I was watching on another interview in Pine Switch. This was Sister Natalia, uh,
Hmm.
who she joined nunnery. She was an Eastern Catholic nun, and uh, she was discussing why she joined the nunnery and her decision making process, and that she did not expect to be doing it at any point. Like it kind of took her by surprise, and she was just doing her due diligence as she considered, to be a good Catholic, to discern, but I don't think it's going to lead anywhere, right? And she fell the monastery. But at one point, she makes the very astute observation that she says, "So I had to leave and come back because at the time when I was joining the monastery early on, I thought I was like too unlovable and had too many flaws that no one would ever marry me. And you can't enter, you don't join the nunnery because you're running away from something, right? Like I think that was a line in the Bells of St. Mary's as well. You don't join the line. You don't join because you're running away from something. You don't join the nunnery because you think you're going to be a bad wife or a bad husband. You join because you think you can make a good nun, right? Or that can help you become a better person. It might be a better way of putting it. But she says you need to be able to believe yourself to be able to be a good, husband or good, wife outside of the nunnery before you can make that decision to enter it. So I think too, repentance makes sense on that, from that perspective.
Yeah.
It was a good interview, by the way. She was on a couple of times. I always recommend her interviews.
Yeah, I keep hearing about her. I've never met her or heard her speak yet, but I guess I'll have to look her up too. Yeah, I think we have a tendency also to think like, well, I was talking to someone the other day, and that and they said, well, I don't bother going to confession anymore because it doesn't seem to make any difference. I just go back and do the same sins over and over again. And I said, well, that's like saying, I don't brush my teeth because I'm just gonna get food all over them again.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. It's a lot. Again, these good old desert fathers. It's just plain logic, really. You want to clean. You want to write a novel. You clean off your desk, and you sit there with a blank sheet of paper. If you got words or worse yet, if you got foul language written all over the piece of paper, you're never going to write a beautiful poem or a novel or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. There was one of my favorite stories in the book was the monk. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. I think it involved it was a cup that was dirty, and then he asked him to come in the next day and go like, all right, goes clean out the cup, and he goes, is the clean now? He goes, well, yeah. And he goes, all right, and then he uses it again the next day. He goes, is it dirty? He goes, yeah, clean it. He goes, he cleans it. He goes, is it clean? He goes, yeah. And he goes, and then he understood because he was complaining that, I keep needing to go back to confession for the same sins. And then it's like, just because you need to keep working on particular sins doesn't mean that it's worth doing the work.
And as Abba Paphnutius would say, you could confess your sins and then get lucky, get hit by a car or something. One of them says something like, "Keep trying to do what's right. Who knows? You might get lucky and die." that you just know, you can't know that a miracle is out of the question, or that you may, if you confess now, you might. It might last long enough to get you to the next stage, whatever that is. It's all about God's grace, right? In the end, the retreating, the repenting, all prayer is basically just making yourself a clean and empty vessel for God to fill with whatever wisdom He deems appropriate.
So the third step then is rebuild. In the context of making a decision, what does that mean?
Well, this is my favorite stage because it's basically why I became a monk. That if you want, and this I got from pagan writers, or at least not pagans, just secular writers. In particular, a book by Charles Duhigg called "The Power of Habit." That he did all these studies, or at least he read them all, that begin to show that people who are like really self-disciplined, who consistently make good decisions, they're actually not any better when isolated than anyone else is. Like people who are really athletic are just as inclined to sit back and eat a donut and watch a movie as anyone else. The difference is that they set up their environment so that it conduces good behavior, right? Like this, or this Pulitzer Prize winning sociologist named Kahneman, I think is his name. He wrote a book called Nudge, I think, and he pointed out that in Texas high schools, and apparently Texan kids are kind of fat. Sorry, no offense to my Texas friends, but they had this problem with obesity in Texas grade schools. So what they did was they just switched the location of the salad bar and the dessert tray. They put the salad bar first, so that by the time the kids got to the dessert tray, there wasn't as much room on the plate. And so like per kid, they lost like a pound and a half just by rearranging the floor plan. And so if if you want to lose weight, you just throw away all the capes and cookie, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. All the sweet stuff you throw in the trash can. Say mix up with some coffee grounds so you won't go for it later, and then you'll just sort of by default, or people who want to get in shape, they join a workout group or a running club that will come by your house and ask why you're not there. So really, and in my book on humility, I said there are two kinds of men who become a monk. There are those for whom it fits their character, and those for whom it tames their character. And like for me, it's obviously I'm definitely the second type. That if I weren't in a place where there were appointed times for prayer, and if I missed them, the guys didn't, come find me. Well, if I weren't in that circumstance, I would just be out of control. So I just put I'm not any better. In fact, I'm probably a lot worse at praying than most people, but I do it more often because I've just set up my environment so that I have to. Um, so yeah, you retreat so that you can hear God. You repent so that you can get rid of the stuff that's clouding your vision, and then you rebuild your environment so that it's conducive to making a good decision. And half of the great decisions made are just made because you couldn't do the wrong thing. I tell the kids that, like, in my theology of the body class, what it all boils down to for them is I say, look, I just want you to make the decision now and not in the backseat of a car. Okay. If a backseat of a car is not where you want to decide how your chastity is going to end up, well, then don't put yourself in the backseat. Like, decide now that you're not going to be alone in your car with your girlfriend. Okay. And then it'll be much easier to make the decision the right way when the time comes. Um, so yeah, the third part has to do with not so much making the decision as preparing yourself for future good decisions.
So you would say that the rebuild is about now that you have uh, moved into this space where you're alone and you have gone through your flaws and your faults, you're trying to actively make yourself into the sort of person who could make good decisions.
Right, right. I'm not a person. I frankly, if I'm going to be honest, which I suppose I ought to be, I'm not a person who makes good decisions. I tell the kids, much to their amusement, that if I were not a monk, I would still be living with my parents. I would be addicted to pornography and video games. There's no doubt about it. But I just uprooted and stuck myself in a place where that just wasn't possible. So I'm not any holier than the next guy, but I do, I have stuck myself in a place where I have to maintain a certain minimum degree of holiness at least just to keep living here.
Or it'll kick you out.
Right. Well, yeah, if we kicked out all the sinners, there'd be nobody left. But at least I mean, the whole point of the monastic life is to make it easier to be virtuous because you're in an environment where it's more difficult to do big bad things.
Okay, so you've now moved through step one of the decision-making process. You
Yeah.
have moved into you have a decision to make. Let's say we're choosing between should we'll use my example from earlier. Should I take this job, right?
Right.
So you've moved on your own to a place of silence, and you've asked God for help. You've looked through your own personal flaws and faults, and you have resolved to correct them and be better. And you have uh, started to think of, like, okay, now that I've done that, what can I do to ensure that these flaws don't overcome me in the future? We've made
Mhm.
it through step one. So let's go to
Right.
step two. We're at think.
But
Uh,
yeah, good.
the first part of thinking is reduce. What does that mean?
Well, I think we have a tendency to think we've got to make a bunch of decisions all at once. Like when it comes to deciding whether you're going to take a job or not, you might say, well, I could take this job, but it would mean I'd have to relocate. I'd have to break up with this person I'm dating. I'd have to, well, wait, okay, let's take those one at a time. First of all, do you want to relocate? Because if you don't, the rest of the decisions are moot, right? I mean, it's the Desert Father story that I tell with this one is that this kid comes in, or this novice comes to the old abbot and he says, I have all these temptations and I don't know how to fight them all. He says, well, don't fight them all, just fight one, because this is a demon with many heads. If you cut off one head, then the others will bleed out somewhat, and they'll be easier to fight. That I think a lot of the decisions we make are actually like 3 or 4 or 5 decisions that we think we have to make all at once. But if we just make them, if we try to simplify the question, divide it up into its constituent parts, and make those decisions one at a time, that it becomes much easier. So that's, I think, what I meant by reduce. Like we reduce the problem to the simplest possible elements.
All right, so by reduce, we mean we're going to take this decision, simplify it as much as we could, and try and make it so that instead of making multiple, decisions at once, we're going to work on one at a time. So
Right.
let's say that I'm
Well, like
looking at
for
making.
example, well, when people talk about like should this person have an abortion, right? Here we're gonna get real controversial and deep right away, but when they say like should she
It's
have an
like a
abortion?
5
Well,
on the scale for this live stream. Don't worry.
okay, good. Well, what about the girl whose father raped her? You're going to tell her she can't have an abortion? Okay. Well, what we're talking about is like 5 different issues all at once: incest, rape, the difficulty for a young teenage girl to make any decision, and then whether the kid it's a human being or not. But let's reduce this to its constituent elements. We all know that rape is a horrifying thing. So yes, that would be a good reason to have an abortion. So would incest. So would being a teenage girl who doesn't have much of a future. But there's another issue there that is a separate question. It's a very simple question, which is that a human being? If it's a human being, if that is a living human person, well, let's solve that question first, and then get to the others. Because if you can isolate whether, if you can figure out whether this is a living person or not, the other questions are just almost irrelevant.
There's
Yeah,
a
and
there's
I would
a
agree with that. As I said, when we abortion is like a 5 of 10 on the controversial scale for this live stream, and
I'm about to up it.
we're wholeheartedly on the side of anti-abortion,
Right.
what we might call pro-life, and it's one of those things where I had a very, very eye-opening experience once. I was taking an ethics class in community college years ago. I actually liked the teacher who, he was a Catholic, but he was kind of so he claimed, but he was kind of a Catholic in name only. Uh, he was the president of the college. I actually liked him, and he
Yeah.
liked me because I was fascinated in the class, and I was dreading the abortion discussion because I knew I would be one of the only people who was pro-life. And I very seriously considered skipping class that day, but I did not.
Yeah.
I went into class, they had the abortion discussion, and this was a real thing, a conversation we had, and it gets onto what you were saying. Like, they finally go, like, there was a woman there who was probably in her 40s, who was a mother, and who just thought that I was awful because I was pro-life. She was like, I nearly died in my pregnancy. And I'm like, so what? Not that I did not say that.
Yeah.
But I was like, okay, but you can't kill your child.
Yeah.
And finally, we have a discussion at the end. They do a poll. The poll is split almost entirely along gender lines. The men are anti-abortion mostly, not entirely. The women are pro-abortion mostly, not entirely. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, not surprising to me at all, but this was one of the most eye-opening moments to me, is that somebody makes a comment, and they make it, and everybody nods like this was, obvious and common sense. It's like, people who are, they say put it up for adoption. The people who are adopted, they live, like, who knows what sort of life they might live. Like, they might grow up in poverty. They might grow up in abusive homes or foster homes. So I heard this, and I couldn't believe it, because to me, you might see, perhaps because you have the same, you think of it the same way as I do, so perhaps you see the same issue that I do. I was like almost blown away that they had said this, and I raised my hand, and I said, are you saying that it's better to be dead than adopted?
That's
And they
right.
looked at me like I had three heads. Like, they had legitimately, they were flabbergasted that anybody would say this. Like, it had never occurred to them that this is what they were saying.
Right, because
But
they
of course,
hadn't addressed the first
exactly.
and most basic issue, which is this a human being? If it's a human being, then all that stuff, though heartbreaking and whatever and convincing, is frankly irrelevant. Yeah.
It was
There's
an eye-opening experience, though. Go ahead.
There's currently a debate going on in the dissident sphere, which is one of the things that was inevitable to come up when you're dealing with Nietzscheans, and that is what is the value of a human life? Of course, the only way a Christian should respond to a Nietzschean is, why are you barking at me? You cannot make a moral argument that does not center from human power. Uh, which is, to me, the only answer that you can give them, because by the Nietzschean standard of power, God is the most powerful, therefore he can set the standard of morality. I don't consider Nietzsche half as crazy as some other people do. I just go, yeah, so the perfect Superman's God and Jesus Christ and all that jazz. Next question. I also see that in Evola. He talks about this king, this priest, and it's like this Jesus Christ. That's just Jesus Christ, the intercessor between us and God, so on and so forth. And they're going, well, if you're anti-abortion, you can't also be against people migrating from Africa or South America into your territories.
What?
Yes, it's very confusing. It's very dumb. It is not a good take. Because from their perspective, the idea of, say, I don't want to use a real people, so I'm going to say high Brazilians from the mythical island that's off the coast of Brazil and gave it its name, who unfortunately range from 70 to 90 IQ.
Hello?
You got muted for a moment there, Ben. Oh
Ben!
no.
The last thing
I don't know
said.
if he got interrupted or something, since it looks as if his microphone's muted.
Hold on. What was the
There he is.
last thing I said?
Hi, Brazilians.
Right.
Yes.
High Brazilians who are unfortunately between, 70 to 90 IQ. They are tribal in structure and, all this other things that, they're not Christian. They're certainly not Christian. That, is, shall we say, not great for a high civilization. Now, to anyone with any sense, anti-abortion does not demand open borders. We're not libertarians. We don't demand free trade and the open borders that come with them. And so neither side gets that it is perfectly reasonable for a Nietzschean to judge human life by their usefulness and level of civilization. And no one gets that. You know, the moral argument will eternally be the Christians, because any wise Christian knows that you can stop a people from coming into your land, and you can stop abortion based on eugenics and other matters. Like, there's no contradiction between anti abortion and strong borders. In fact, the fact that the Crusades are justifiable from biblical standards and other standards as well as what God says about the nations and their spirit and their how they're set up by Him directly. You know, and even to the point they might have their own angels, and they certainly have their own princes, as Daniel experienced. Uh,
Well,
you know it. You know,
but
the demands of a moral argument for anti-abortion does not apply to the demands of protecting your people from quote unquote invaders.
yeah, but again, here, like reducing the question to its basic elements, if you just say, look, man may not do evil, we all agree on that, and you can't do evil so that good may come of it, we all agree on that. Okay,
Yep.
is protecting your border evil? Well, it's not. Is killing a baby evil? Well, it is. So there's the difference. You know, if
Yep.
it's you
Yep.
don't have to start talking about like whether these people are invaders or innocent or guilty or whatever. And the point is, one is an ipso facto evil thing to do,
Yep.
and the other isn't.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And that's
Well,
kind of the
crazy
point.
simple. Yeah.
Exactly. It's one of those things, you know, Ben and I, so the publisher of one of my books is a controversial character.
Hmm.
Ben, are you okay if I talk about this, or would you
That's
rather I
fine.
not?
Oh boy, I
A
like that.
controversial character called Vox Day. He has a blog.
Ooh.
I agree with him probably about 50% of the time, but I like him. He was a good editor, and I appreciate that the publishing house he runs, which is called Castalia House. But Vox did make a point once where he says, like, I've been accused, you know, and of being racist. Now, he's one of those people, you know, it turns eventually, I think that the term racist has become kind of white noise, and it turns into a word game. And one of the reasons that Vox is so controversial is that he's just kind of decided that one day that he was going to stop playing the word game. So he'll go, sure, I'm racist. But then you actually dig into him on what he believes on specific issues, and not really, but you get the idea, right? Like,
Yeah.
he no longer cares if you consider him racist. So he'll just go, if that's what you consider racist, then sure, right? Well, however, he pointed out one day, he goes, I'm supposedly this racist white supremacist. He says, and yet, he goes, I would not kill a mentally handicapped black female child, right? He's like, I would say that they deserve to live, and the other side would kill them. He's like, he goes, to be honest, I don't really care if it would or would not. I just think that's interesting. And he's
Yeah.
absolutely right, though. Like, it's a good point where you go, like, I see. He goes, you know, so if it's a female, they're black. It's a female. It's black, inner city, poor, right? Like,
Has an
part of
equal
a
claim
single,
on life as a upper middle class white guy.
yeah, child of a single mother, has maybe baby daddy. I would not want that child to die, right? Like,
Right.
I think that life has value.
Yep.
You know,
Chris
apparently,
Rock is
the
good
other
on
side
this
does
one
not.
too.
Chris Rock, I'm very wary of. One of the problems is, and I noticed this with Pints with Aquinas, he said, in a way, Chris Rock is actually worse than other people because he acknowledges that the child is a baby, but he's still pro-abortion.
Well,
So,
I think
are you
he's
just saying that?
secretly not. I think he's secretly not. I think he's
True,
socking
but
it
that's
to the
not
pro-vote.
the impression. It's possible, but that's not the impression he's giving to people.
I don't know. He says he's a comedian, so you gotta distinguish between the persona he plays on stage, which could be just an evil person, and his actual offstage self. But I mean, nobody but an utter psychopath would say, "I say kill the babies. I say give me an ice cream. What is it? What does he say? You should be able to kill your baby all the way up until its first report card, right? And that's just so obviously wrong and evil. Even he's got to know that. So
Here's the problem, though.
there's a
Is
lesson
it?
to be learned.
Is it actually that
Ah,
obvious? And
well, we've
we
gotten to the
think it's
point where it might
obvious.
not be. Yeah,
Yeah, we think it's obvious. I think it's obvious. Ben thinks it's obvious. But remember, in the grand history of the world, child sacrifice is a norm throughout times and cultures, not an aberration.
yeah.
Yeah. The
Well,
I mean,
Romans did it
and
to a lower extent. The Carthaginians did it to a very great extent. Uh, the Spartans did it. It's
the Romans
not.
could have the father paterfamilias kill the kid on his first report card. Like that's not even an exaggeration. They could do it. The father had
yeah.
that power.
And also, there are a lot of things that were obvious to us about 5 years ago that are suddenly not obvious. Like, are there two? How many genders are there? Or, I mean, things that again, I don't know. I keep thinking about my theology of the body class, but I keep saying, look, if we can't agree that there are male and female, then that's like me. I mean, that's such basic human logic, just basic logic, period, that it's like I don't even know where we go from here. It's like trying to debate physics with the flat earther. It's there. We can't agree on basic human scientific truth. Well, then, and people they've taken away my reductio ad absurdum. I used to be able to say, well, what's next? But like you're right. It's not necessarily obvious that killing a 4-year-old is immoral.
I mean, Peter Singer has been making that argument
Right.
for years,
At
right? He's been
Yale, right?
pushing
Yeah.
it. Princeton, but yeah,
Princeton.
he's been
Wow.
making that argument for years. And I guess there's the question of like, is he just honestly mistaken, or is he a monster? Is he a monstrous liar who wants to kill babies? And then you go, who cares? Either way, he wants to kill babies. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a point where you just kind of be like, no, we don't accept those sorts of opinions. They're evil. But moving on to, so that's, we've gone to the second step. We've reduced it down. Now let's go back to my job making decision. It's okay. I might need to leave do I want to leave my family behind? Do I want to leave my hometown behind and, be on my own in a new city? No. Let's get rid of all that. We're going to reduce it to this first question. Is
That's
this
right.
a job that I would want to take? Right.
Yeah.
So let's go that. We've reduced. Now,
Mhm.
what do you mean by refer? This next section.
Well, it's again, my students are all like, well, it's more important to try out the waters before you jump in. You should be able to sleep around before you get married. And I say, well, wait a second, hold on. Every civilization in the history of the world, like every religion, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, they all have taught for thousands of years that that's a bad idea. But you three figured it out like within the last 2 years. Like, what are the odds of that? Like, a lot of times, like the problems that we face have already been solved by someone else. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you have a big decision to make. But we have a tendency just to disregard our elders as somehow either sadistic or selfish or both. Um, so you want to seek the advice of people who are older and smarter and holier than yourself, but it comes with a caveat. You don't ask somebody, even a holy person, like, what would you do? Like, right? Because if you're thinking about getting married and you say to me, Father Augustine, what would you do? I'd say, well, ditch her and become a monk, right? But that may not be your best interest. You ask them, how would you make this decision? because wise and holy people tend to have good ways of making decisions.
All right, so we'll summarize refer as look to the opinions of those who you trust and see what they would say on how would they do it? What
Right.
decision would they make?
Exactly. Well, no. How would they make that decision?
How would they Okay, so
Not
yeah,
what
that was
decision would
one
they
thing
make
that you do
because
specify. Mhm.
yeah. But
How would they make this decision?
that's actually pretty crucial because we do have a tendency to say, "Well, what would you do?" But that's not it's really not very helpful to know what someone else would do in your situation, right? Not most of the time. Unless they have all the exact same goals and values as you do. Hmm.
But it's more important, how would you make this decision? So, hey, if you were had so let's say that somebody who I trust will go. I've mentioned that Ben and I have served as accountability partners in a sense. So I go up to Ben, and I go, Ben. Instead of asking him, "Would you take this job if you were me?" Instead, I say to him, "Hey, Ben. If you had to make a decision about whether or not take a new job, what would you do? Like, how would you
Yeah.
make it?" Ask that
Especially
question.
given everything that I know about this situation. How would you use
Right.
my information? Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's step two of our thing. Now reflect, and this one I think is a little bit easier to understand because it's a word that's kind of
Yeah.
more common. But how would you use it? Like, what do you mean by reflect?
Well, I think that there are three ways basically to make a decision, and two of them are helpful, but disastrous if you take them in isolation. You can really think your way to an answer, which is great, but I have talked myself into a lot of bad decisions. So I can tell you that thinking is not infallible. In fact, I pretty much will go with whoever has the best argument on a given issue if I rely entirely on my intellect. And then I'll change my mind every time I run into somebody smarter. Hello.
Hmm.
Yeah, hi.
Oh, I see. Okay, did we lose that much? I hope not. Okay, that's good. That's not so bad. So, going back to where we were with reflect, you were talking about the your intellect is not infallible.
Right, right. I mean, in fact, we have an old monk here who, when the young guys, when the junior monks have an argument, he'll walk in and he'll say, "Wow, you know what? You have a great argument there, but and I trust you, but I'm guessing there's someone in the world smarter than you that thinks otherwise. I'm just gonna go with that guy." and his position is basically logical, and it's the way I used to make decisions, which was just whoever had the best argument, I'd go with that. But the intellect is not infallible, and I often talk myself into terrible decisions, or used to. Well, no, still do. So you don't want to rely entirely on the intellect. On the other hand, people will say, well, follow your heart, right? But that is manifestly a terrible thing for me to do, because if I followed my heart, I'd be married and divorced about 80 times over, like just since Monday. So following your heart, you don't want to do something you hate or that you think is stupid. But on the other hand, there's must be some third way of making a decision that does not rely entirely or even mostly on those two factors. And that is like when you make a decision to get married, or better yet, to charge that machine gun nest or throw yourself on a grenade, you don't think through the statistical likelihood of saving yourself versus saving your friends. And you definitely don't say to yourself, I really want to throw myself on that hand grenade. There's something deeper, which I guess Aquinas would call the will, which is informed by the intellect and the emotions, and you follow that. Granted, the intellect and will can be parsed out as well, but that's all part of the reflection process. We have I think this is in the book, but we have a guy who joined the novitiate with me, who could not make up his mind between the Dominicans and the Benedictines. So he flipped a coin. He said, heads, I'm a Benedictine; tails, I'm a Dominican. And it came up tails, and he was disappointed. So he decided to become a Benedictine.
Yeah, that's an old technique, and I think a good one.
Right. Well, it's a good one because it tells you what you're really feeling, right? Because feelings are hard to parse out, and so are thoughts, for that matter. So reflecting is about incorporating all these things to bring all these things together, and then subjecting them to your highest faculty, which is your will.
All right, so uh, we have prayed. We've moved off to our own. We've looked at our flaws and our sins, and we have tried to keep them and take them into account and work through them and turn ourselves into the sort of person who won't make those sorts of decisions, or at least begun that process. Now we have looked at all of the various aspects of this decision and reduced them down to only one, the bare essentials, the minimum that we need to consider for the moment. We have consulted with people who we trust and gotten their takes on the issue, making sure that we are asking them how they make decisions and not what decision they would make. And we've reflected on everything that we have learned throughout this process. So now we are ready to act. Part 3.
That's right.
I think this one, in some ways, is the simplest because all 3 words, just without even reading the book, I kind of know what you mean by them.
Right. Yeah.
And that's good because we're a little low on time, but not super. I don't think we're not super strict on our time limits here, but resolve.
Right.
So what does that mean? I have my own. I mean, I read the book, so I don't have a guess. I know what it means, but what does it mean?
Well, for that, I turned to an atheist. The guy, and I can't. DeBottom, I think, is his name. Great name, by the way. I hadn't actually. Anyway, probably a little worse than Wetta, actually, but yeah, Elaine DeBottom, who wrote an article for the New York Times called "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Woman," and his job is actually to teach computers to make decisions. But he found that computers will basically go on forever compiling data. They will never make a decision. So at what point do you stop compiling data and start making the decision? And then he started thinking about like his own relationship with his wife, and how, like, what are the odds that he would actually run into the perfect match, right? And what are the odds that he will someday run into a better match than the woman he's with? Well, the odds that she is an imperfect match for him are exponential, and the odds that he'll find someone better someday are pretty good. So, by those likelihoods, he really ought to just never get married. Or worse yet, there should be no happily married people ever anywhere. And yet there are. Mysteriously, there are millions of happily married couples around. How do they do it? Well, he says you just make the decision and then commit to it. And that in the end, and he doesn't say this, but I do, you're it's not the happiest, holiest, most disciplined people I know are not the people who make good decisions. They're the people who make the best of all the terrible decisions they've made. Right? You're always going to make the wrong decision. And even if it's the right decision, you'll probably screw it up. So you might as well just commit to what you've done, right? And try to make the best of it. Or
Yeah,
to use the restaurant metaphor, which has been done by other people, but you walk in the restaurant and you say, should you have steak or lobster? Steak or lobster, steak or lobster. Finally, you order the lobster. You don't then spend the rest of the meal thinking about the steak, right? That's just the recipe for an unhappy meal. Instead, you say, tonight I'm a lobster man, and that's that. And that's the way to be happy and to make good decisions. So, which leads us right into the next step, which is just relax. Like, enjoy the decision now that you've made it, right?
yeah, you're absolutely right. So this is something that uh, I've had multiple conversations that I've actually reflected a lot about, because there's something in the scriptures that always sticks out to me, and that, like, we're commanded not to fear, right? Like, we're not just told, like,
Yeah.
fear is a bad idea. We're told, do not be afraid, don't fear, don't fear, don't fear, over and
Right.
over and over again.
Right.
Fear, in a sense, although it's an emotion, like, there's a decision there, and that decision, and insofar as it's a decision, it's sin, right? And then
Right.
even insofar as it's not a decision, it reflects a lack of faith.
Yeah.
So
But here's the thing.
there's
This is
definitely, go ahead.
Well, this is what I love about the Desert Fathers is one of them at some point says something to the effect of, "If you have a hard decision, thank God, because that either means you're choosing between two goods, in which case it doesn't matter really. I mean, you're going to end up in a good spot either way, or you're choosing between two bads, in which case it doesn't really matter what your decision because you're screwed either way. So." you're a hard decision is actually a blessing. It's the easy decisions that like are trickier.
Yeah,
So
you're
you might as well just
absolutely
relax.
right. It's one of those things, like, that we're commanded not to fear, which is very difficult. But, fear, in one sense, it's just an emotion. How do you just not fear,
It's
right?
illogical,
Uh,
really.
yeah, but on the other hand, even that emotion comes from a real lack of faith, right? So,
Yeah,
and as we were discussing this, it became one of those things where it was like, there is a sense where it's like, even if we make a decision, even if it's not objectively the exact best thing that we could or should have done, uh, God is still going to be working through it, right?
right.
Now, were we trying? Like, were we trying to do it for God? Even if we weren't doing our very best, did we think we were trying? Like, was that part of our thought process? Because if it was, God is going to, right? He's going to make straight, right straight with crooked lines here,
Right.
right? Uh,
And I think sometimes people think of God's will like it's some sort of crazy puzzle. Like he has one thing that he's got in planned for us, and it's a secret. And if we don't figure it out, our whole life's gonna be miserable. But I don't think he works that way. I think we work in tandem with God on this in this way.
Yeah, it's I forget where I read this. It was some commentary that I read. I wish I could give credit, but unfortunately I don't remember who it was who said this. But they pointed out that Moses is a really good example because they said of like decision making. Because if you read the story of Moses, they said this is probably in a sense not how the story had been
Mhm.
planned to go. Moses,
Yeah.
they said, like plan A was probably that Moses, when he reached, an age of maturity and had a high place in the Pharaoh's court, would simply lead the Israelites out of Egypt with no fuss, right?
Right.
But
Right.
instead, Moses freaks out, kills a man, uh, somewhat understandably, because he was torturing someone who Moses had only recently learned was his fellow countryman, right? But
Right.
freaks out, kills a man, flees, and runs away. Like, he does make a decision. He makes a very stark, very strong, very straightforward decision. He runs away. And most adaptations, for good reasons, like for reasons of narrative unity, don't really include this, but he doesn't just leave. He leaves for 40 years. Like, he is gone. He has completely left. Probably almost everybody who he knew has died. Now, I don't blame adaptations for shortening this because dramatically, you could read it and read 40 years and then you could just pick up where you left off and it's just one line that says, oh, and 40 years passed. But when you're watching a movie, it's a little bit more jarring,
By
right?
the
Or
way,
an
and it,
adaptation.
it it couldn't have been God's plan for him to destroy the Ten Commandments the first time he gave it to him either.
Right, exactly. In a sense, Moses is a very impulsive person who often
Yeah.
makes the wrong decisions.
Right.
Uh, he makes the wrong decisions, but
He
God
could have
didn't
used
even
my
really
book.
chastise. God rarely chastises Moses. In fact, God mostly praises Moses. The one time he
Uh-huh.
chastises Moses is, to my recollection, one of like outside of very, very small things, like God's kind of exasperated with Moses. But the one time is at the end of his life when he strikes the rock and God says, "You're not going to enter the promised land," uh, which is, a major, certainly a major thing. But like it goes with the impulsiveness of Moses. There are always people who wonder, like, that seems like an awfully big punishment, but for a
Yeah.
small thing that Moses did. And while that's true, I think that you need to remember that the character of Moses, he's probably somebody who has been impulsively doing this stuff all along, and we're looking at a last straw without seeing the buildup, right?
Well, and if the Greeks are right, his tragic flaw is also his heroic strength, and that passion is probably what kept the kept the Israelites motivated all that time.
Yeah, he was. Mhm.
Right. Mm. Yeah. Okay. Right. Mhm. What? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, my favorite is Psalm 57, which says, Lord, break the teeth in their mouths. May they wither like the snail that dissolves into slime. Break the teeth of these wild beasts, O Lord, and we will bathe our feet in the blood of the wicked. My rugby team, I used to have my rugby team say it before every game. But well, if you see something really evil or mean or cruel and you're not upset by it, there's something really wrong with you. I think, yeah, C.S. Lewis was the first to point that out in a way that I thought was logical.
Yeah, a good that's a very good point as well. So we're right at the end now of the decision making process,
That's right.
and I have made my decision with this job, right?
Right.
So I have decided we'll use the real life example. I decided not to take this particular job.
Okay.
I've relaxed because the decision has been. After I resolved to make the decision, I contacted and told them I'm sorry, I'm not going to be accepting this job. I relax because the decision's been made and there's no more pressure anymore. But even though there is definitely an element of you can relax because God is going to be in control, and you have at least made an effort, even if not your best effort, you have made an effort to bring God into it, meaning that God is going to be at play here, right? You
Right.
still must revisit this decision.
Yeah.
Uh,
Be-
so let's go into revisit.
Well, because you may still have made the wrong decision, and what and this is where Saint Ignatius is very helpful. He talks about consolations and desolations. That if you make the wrong decision, then God will make you unsettled for the long term. That you'll feel this deep sense of that something's wrong, but the devil will give you a kind of a sugar high will make you kind of thrilled in the short term. If you've made the right decision, then you'll feel scared at first, but in the long run, you'll feel this sense of deep and abiding peace. And he says you got to check in with those feelings from time to time to decide whether you've made the right decision. But the other thing is like the the internet at least is full of bad advice on this. Like, don't let anyone keep you from fulfilling your dreams. You just never give up. But sometimes you need to give up, right? This if you're I mean, I have Parkinson's and I don't care how much I want to be a brain surgeon. The fact is, if you ever see me coming toward you with a scalpel, run for the door because I shake. My hands are not very steady. So
There's a moment. It's a movie that I thought was good, not great, probably a little overrated, but I enjoyed it. It's called Soul. It's a Pixar movie. Ben, have you seen it? I
oh,
saw it a couple years ago. It was good, not great, but it had a moment in it that this makes me think of that I thought was actually a very profound moment in the movie. It's all
yeah.
about a guy dies and he believes it's before his time, and there's a soul that there's another soul that he learns in the afterlife. There's like a waiting area for souls that haven't been assigned like bodies yet. And
Hmm.
this soul doesn't want to leave the waiting area. And there's a really fascinating scene where they go back, and this new soul, it's pretty convoluted without actually watching the film, is now inhabiting his body. And
Okay.
he's having a conversation with his barber, right? The main character's barber. And
Yeah.
the barber, I forget exactly what he said, but he mentioned something like maybe he wanted to be a surgeon or something. I can't recall exactly. And she goes, "Wow, I'm really sorry for you that this is your life now." And the barber looks at him because it's in a guy's body, surprised, and goes, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, slow your roll there. I didn't say that I was unhappy." And then they go,
Yeah.
"What?" And then he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "No, He goes, "I love my job." Why? He goes, "It's not what I originally wanted to do. It's like, but it's a good job. It's enjoyable. It's fun. I get to
Right.
meet interesting people. I do well for myself. I don't, right? I run a business." And I thought that was like a surprisingly profound moment in the movie. Now,
Yeah.
I think it dropped the ball in a couple of other aspects, but this isn't a review of the movie, so we'll. But that honestly made me think, like at the time, like because it's about going through your life, realizing it's like our culture has put such a priority on you know accomplishing your dreams, living your dream, right?
Follow your
And if you
blue
don't live your
flame.
dream, then you're a failure, right? And this
Right.
is not even subtext, really. It's just text in the culture, right?
Yeah.
It's everywhere, right? You got to follow your dreams, you got to live your dreams. But that's
Don't
why I
let
thought it was.
anyone discourage you.
Mhm. And that's why I thought it was really profound that this mainstream Hollywood movie, it was Pixar, right? Like this
Yeah.
mainstream Hollywood movie at a moment where they acknowledge that this person did not accomplish their dreams, but that's not the key to happiness in life.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, it actually made me think for a moment of there's a sense there where yeah, I found that kind of profound. So when you're revisiting this decision, you still need to look and you still need to decide like I think it's less is this the right decision because it's already made. So whether it's right or wrong isn't the point, but
Yeah.
was my process as good as it could have been?
Right. Well, and then there are people who have stupid dreams or evil dreams or ugly ambitions who really ought to listen to wiser people and give them up. I mean, whatever Jeffrey Dahmer's dreams and ambitions were, he would have done well to listen to someone else, follow someone else's dream, perhaps.
Part
Um,
of what I did, so we have our horror anthology podcast, and part of my and we have three detectives that are solving like supernatural mysteries. That's our podcast. You should listen. It's good.
I
Uh,
will.
but part of my character and like what I was trying to do with my character was that I created a person who was in many ways like a world both a worldly success and a worldly failure. Like that, he had tried to live out the dreams of the world. He was in my version of the character, like he was a real estate magnate and he became rich and he had a beautiful wife. He had great friends, but he was worldly. And eventually, deals start going south, and then his friends aren't his real friends and they leave him, and he goes to the drink and his wife leaves him and he ends up alone. So then he ends up becoming like a detective for the supernatural organization, and he he goes back to the church, right? He goes back to the church of his childhood, you know, and he finds that salvation there. But part of the point of what I was doing here was that he joins this organization and he's making a positive impact there, but it's a small and limited impact. They're a small organization, and he is not a person who is like naturally suited to this. He had to be trained for it because everything else that he did had failed, right? He tried to become a success in the world and it did not work. So now that failed, somebody here, he meets a mentor who's helping him and says, and teaches him how to shoot. He teaches him how to shoot a gun so he could kill a monster, right? Teaches him about the dark forces on the other side and in the underworld and how to combat them. But ultimately, there are people who are like lifelong trained monster hunters in this organization, and then there's Sean, who's just some guy, right? And that's kind of the point. That was what I was going for, where it's like, in a sense, he is a complete failure in all the ways that matters to the world. He followed his dreams, and he even achieved them to a point. And but the world, none of that matters to the world, right? And I had, as a kind of a point of contrast, an alternate universe version of the character who doesn't ultimately fail out, right? Like who real, because there's a bit of a cheat where it's like, okay, but his dreams did fail. But in this alternate universe version of the character, he becomes a horrible villain, right? Like he becomes a horrible person. He manipulates people. He dominates lesser people. He becomes involved in the occult, which I think is very common among the elites, by the way, although conspiracy theory-ish, but I think it's true. Like he becomes involved in the occult, and as if he had remained a worldly success, he would have ended up becoming a horrible human being, what we would, a monster, right? But because he became a failure, he becomes a servant of God. And even though it's a servant of God in a small way, God uses you in ways that you don't fully understand and that you'll never fully understand until everything is done with. So that revisiting, I think, is about looking at the process and also seeing, now that the decision has been made, how is God using you? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think I think especially the internet is full of bad advice on this. I had a kid in class who turned around to the rest of the kids during a class discussion and said, "You guys call yourself Christians, but I know you better than that. I see you on the weekends. At least I'm true to myself." And I thought, well, good for you, Chad. Good job. And but a kid in the back who had been sleeping the whole semester woke up just long enough to say to him, "Yeah, well, at least we're trying to be true to somebody better than us," which I thought was also a valid point. I mean, you there's a limit to what you. I mean, all of our ambitions are ultimately limited by our own sinfulness and lack of perspective. So in the end, obedience is what saves us from making the really wrong decisions, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Psalm
That's
119
exactly right.
is a good one for that.
Oh yeah, wait, which one's Psalm 119?
The long one.
Oh yeah, well,
But
yeah,
it
Long.
just
starts
getting
out
through it.
starts out as as a young David, as a quote unquote young man, begging the Lord to help him order his steps and follow His will, which is quite frankly what we're all trying to do here.
Yeah.
I myself find in my personal life that a lot of what I try to do for myself absolutely fails miserably. Like, I'm not just talking, fails, I'm talking crash and burns, and I have to rebuild a bank account from zero. And it keeps happening. So it's like, I understand this through force because I would not understand it outside of it. And it leads from places of hurt to places of healing if you follow the Lord. The idea that we should strike out for ourselves, be independent men, be sovereign citizens, or whatever your Nietzscheans or whatever, is utter nonsense for the Christian, because ultimately, you know, you're gonna fail in this life or the
Yeah,
next. And
that's right.
if we are so lucky that we see the Lord returning in our lifetimes, uh, then what we'll also see is we'll see these Nietzscheans bow the knee like everyone else. One of
Right.
the themes of Mordred within the Pinkerton's Ghosts is that he's this, not that he's explicitly a Nietzschean mind, but he is the powerful single Superman, the Ubermensch. Why should he
Mm.
submit to the same faith as Arthur, his uncle, why, or father, depending on which one you listen to? Why should he submit to all this? When he saw the weakness of Arthur, he saw all the nonsense that went on in his court. It's not worth it. But the thing is, it is worth it. It's just the hard path. It is always easy to please yourselves. It is
Yeah.
hard to go into the desert and seek the Lord. And that's how I'm tying this all into your book, Father Wetta.
Yay! Amen. Well
Uh,
done. You should have written this book. I should have consulted you before I wrote the book.
there's always time for the next one.
That's right.
It's funny because the longer I'm doing this and the more I'm explicitly like seeking the Lord, the more I'm like meeting people to collaborate with, and I'm like, all right, I get it. I get what you're saying. I gotcha.
Don't do this on your own.
Yeah. But Father Wetta, I'll give you the last word. We'll plug your book one more time, and we'll let you go.
Aw, I've really enjoyed this. The last word. Well, if I were going to be really monastic about this, I wouldn't say anything at all. But I'll just pray for you guys and for all of your listeners and may God bless you all and keep you and may shine his light upon you and make you great saints. I mean, in the end, no matter what you decide, no one can keep you from being a saint. So go do it.
Thank you, Father Wetta. Do check out Father Wetta's book. It is in the top chat, the first chat with the direct Amazon link. It is on my short list to read. And Anthony has already read it and given it glowing reviews all throughout our stream. Thank you to
Yay.
Bradford Walker and Javier Olivia for joining us. Do join us next week. We don't really have anything planned for next week, but in the immediate future, we'll have Misha Burnett.
But it'll be great anyway. I promise you that.
It will.
I'm sure you made a listener out of me.
Thank you. But we will have Misha Burnett, who is introducing a new short story collection early in May through Kickstarter. His Atlas of Better
Misha is a very interesting guy and an interesting writer, so that'll be interesting.
What's his name?
Misha Burnett.
Ooh, interesting name.
He's it's very interesting. Actually, he's part of the secret or not so secret cabal of St. Louis writers.
I want to join.
You already joined. We swore you in earlier. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. The blood.
Awesome.
Don't worry about the blood. No. Don't worry about the blood.
Okay. I'll just, I think I won't.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Are we